This is an incredible program, isn't it? This is an incredible conference. Yes. It brings together some of the various disciplines that we need to look at. We are living indeed in momentous times. Momentous times because the non-infectious diseases are taking over. The chronic diseases are taking over. Take a look. Heart disease, stroke, diabetes, cancer. These are diseases that were not always part of our culture. To give you some idea, a textbook was published in 1928 by a very well-known, actually famous physician, Sir William Osler, and he wrote, in 1928, you can expect one heart attack per year in an average hospital, in an average-sized town. Things have changed because today we experience 4,000 heart attacks a day in this country. This is a new epidemic. You look at breast cancer rates, and again, 1960, we would expect 1 out of 20 women to develop breast cancer. 20 years later, 1 in 11. Now it is 1 in 7 women that can expect to experience breast cancer. And then you look at the costs involved here. And the important part of this particular overhead is that the medical costs have risen dramatically. And you say, well, it's probably all part of inflation. So I've put another relationship here for you, and that is the percent of money that we spend of our income on medical care. 1960, we spent about 4 to 5% of our income on medical care. Today, it is 19%. Something is happening. And what is very, very important here is that 84% of our medical dollar in this country, in North America, 84% of our medical dollars is spent on chronic disease. Chronic disease. And yet the best we can do, medically speaking, is to manage the symptoms of most of these diseases. Because these are diseases that are lifestyle related. They have to do with our behaviors. And yet many times we use mechanistic approaches, pharmacological approaches, and the best we can do oftentimes is to just make you feel better, and the disease continues. Chronic disease, it means they hang around. And one of the most devastating ones is diabetes. Diabetes is the mother of all chronic diseases because it takes your body apart from top of your head all the way down to your toes. Every organ becomes affected by diabetes. And diabetes, for very special reasons, has been considered to be the mother of all chronic diseases because of its devastating consequences. And yet, it doesn't have to be that way. 4th week in our randomized clinical trial, 100 people with heart disease have joined this clinical controlled trial. Our goal is to show that within 1 year, we can reverse coronary artery disease and strokes by helping people to go on a very simple diet, a diet of simple elegance, foods as grown, plus exercise, plus a good attitude towards life. We're in our 4th week, and one of my participants raised her hand and says, Dr. Diehl, could I make a statement? I have no idea what she's going to say. But we've already seen significant voices among the participants that have been raised that said, we are doing so much better, we're feeling better. But that again doesn't mean very much to me. Anybody can feel better on any kind of a program. But what are the data? And then she said, for 12 years, I've been told that I needed to count my calories. I need to count my carbohydrates, that I had to eat lean meat to take care of my diabetes. For For 12 years, it has been hammered into me, don't eat starch, don't eat sugar, don't eat carbohydrates, because they're turning into blood sugars. For 12 years, I've been going from medication to medication, and now I'm on 32 units of insulin. And then she said, and this morning, 4th week of the CHIP program, 4th week in this randomized controlled trial, this morning, I took my blood sugar, and it was all the way down to 90, and I knew that I had to reduce my insulin again. And now I'm down to 7 units of insulin in just 4 weeks. And before, it would go higher and higher and higher, and more medication, and more overweight, and I didn't know what to do. And then she said in tears, I don't really believe that these numbers are right, because I cannot change my understanding. I mean, everything has changed. In just 4 weeks, my insulin is down to those few units now. Every day, I had to take about 1, 2, 3 units of insulin down. And I have been afraid, this cannot last. There must be something wrong. And I said, no, for the first time, you're doing something right. For the first time, we're turning the therapeutic approach around. Because in all sincerity and with great respect to my colleagues, when it comes to taking care of type 2 diabetes, if you do everything opposite of what your physician dietitian has told you, you'll be well in 4 to 8 weeks in most cases. And so I want to sound an alert, a diabetes alert. It is estimated that every second American adult will either have diabetes already or will develop the full-blown disease process. Every second American adult. Let's take a look at the trends. Here are some of the trends in the prevalence rates of diagnosed diabetics. We're looking here at the time period from 1994 to 2009. Take a look. 1994, you can see the prevalence of diabetes in percent of the adults in America by state. And when you look at some of the colors, you realize that probably less than 5% in 1994 were diagnosed with diabetes. 3 years later, it is now more like 5% of the population. Then 2000, 3 years later, it is now more like 6-7% of the adult population. 3 years later, it is now 7-8% of the adult population. 2006, it is now 9%, and 2009, more than 9%. What has happened? In just 15 years, the rates of diabetes have doubled, and they double every 15 years. Now, you have seen this pattern before, haven't you? Do you remember we talked about obesity? Do you remember what happened there? This is really scintillating. This is an exciting lecture, isn't it? We have seen the same trends in obesity, because every 5 years we have seen the rate of obesity going up by 5% in the adult population of our society. So that by 2010 now, more than 30% of the adults in America are suffering from obesity. And here you see a very interesting parallel. Every 15 years, obesity doubles. Every 15 years, obesity doubles. Do you see a possible parallel there? Diabetes. We have seen a 900% increase since 1945, and especially in the last 50 years, diabetes has increased by 700%. Now, sometimes people have the idea that diabetes is a genetic disease. It's in the DNA, there's nothing I can do about it. Let's be careful about this. It takes about 300 to 400 years to change the genetics in a society. This has happened in the last 50 years, 700% increase. This cannot be genetics. Somebody must have put something into the water. Or could it be that maybe we have changed our diet? Think about it. It's an enormous shift that is taking place. Now, if a person has a genetic predisposition, they are not doomed to developing diabetes if they make some lifestyle changes, because, as we talked about obesity, There are some genetic predispositions, but you have to pull the trigger of the gun that represents the genetics in order to fire the shot. And the genetics can be overridden by the epigenetics, our lifestyle. We can suppress the bad genes, and we can strengthen and modulate upward the good genes. So here you see the governmental assessment. Diabetes has been inexorably advancing, doubling every 15 years. The chance of becoming a diabetic in the US for a newborn baby in a lifetime is now 1 in 3. If you're Hispanic by background, 1 in 2 babies will become diabetics in a lifetime. And then the National Institute of Health says, and we have no medical cure. But the cure is found in what you are willing to do for yourself. This is largely a self-made disease. This is a disease that is culturally promoted because it's a very profitable disease at the expense of the people. Now let's take a look at what we have. The latest stats show that we have 29 million diabetics. About 21 million have been identified already, diagnosed. 28% don't even know that they have diabetes. And then you have another pre-diabetics, 86 million. Now you think, well, pre-diabetic, so what does that mean? That means you are on your way. You have been developing some of the complications unknown or asymptomatically for you. 29 million diabetics, 86 million pre-diabetics, which means 115 million Americans. And since this is largely an adult disease, you put it in correlation with the amount of adults that we have in the society, and you begin to realize that every second adult in America has a diabetes or is at risk for diabetes. I just came back from the Caribbean islands, and there I was in Dominica. 25 years ago, the chief of the medical officer of the island said to me, 25 years ago, when you came, it was difficult to find diabetes. I said, I remember. He said, today, every second person on our island either has diabetes or is developing diabetes. It is the globalization of our diet that leads to the globalization of diabetes. Now, how do you define diabetes? How do you know that you have diabetes? How do you define diabetes? Well, there are different scales. On the right-hand side, you see the fasting blood sugar, and usually when you have blood sugar below 100, we usually consider that to be fairly normal. When you have blood sugar between 100 and 125, that's what we call pre-diabetes, and anything above 125 usually is considered to be full-blown diabetes, but the disease already begins earlier. So if I ask you, how do you define diabetes? It's a blood sugar that is excessively high, above 125. Anything between 100 to 125 usually is pre-diabetes. Are you with me? Are you with me there? Yeah, okay. Now, there's another scale. It's called the hemoglobin A1C. This is what we use in scientific studies. It's a blood sugar that you develop over a period of 3 months. It's fairly stable because the other blood sugars, they can sort of vary, go up and down somewhat. This is a fairly stable assessment for research. And here we look at numbers like anything below 5.7 is healthy, anything between 5.7 and 6.5 is pre-diabetic, and then anything above 6.5 we consider to be full-blown diabetes. Now this is becoming very, very important, these hemoglobin A1C. Why? Because just 1 point difference, so if you go from 10 to 9, or you go from 8 to 7, and you become more normal again. 1 point difference translates into the change in risk for different complications. For instance, if you are increasing your A1C by 1 point, your nerve damage goes up by 37%, vision loss 37%, blindness, kidney disease, renal disease 37% higher, amputation or death due to peripheral vascular disease increases by 43%. So these are very powerful indicators that help us to understand the tremendous risk for the complications and what you can expect when you are moving towards diabetes. So if you don't have these tests available, how does a person know that they are possibly diabetic? Number one, they find there's a what we call polydipsia. That means these people are thirsty all the time. And so they drink more, and with it you have polyuria. That means you are now getting into an exercise program from the living room to the bathroom many times a day. That's right. So you have frequency in urination that really goes up. Then you have polyphagia. That means you're hungry all the time. I mean, even if you have just eaten, you're still hungry. Diabetes, possible. Then you have to worry about blurred eyesight, tingling in your hands and fingers, feeling fatigued and tired. You just don't have the get up and go anymore. And then, of course, for men, oftentimes the first sign of diabetes is erectile dysfunction or impotence. Now, what is very important when it comes to diabetes, to understand that diabetes is one of the risk factors for atherosclerosis and narrowing of the arteries. It is one of the risk factors, significant risk factors, of heart disease and stroke. Anything to do with the circulatory system, diabetes accelerates the process of arterial closure. So when you look at this chart here from the famous Framingham study, you begin to realize that the three biggest risk factors that drive heart disease and narrowing of the arteries is cholesterol, and then high blood pressure and smoking. And then the very next one, as you see there, is diabetes. Now, if diabetes is a vascular accelerator, an accelerator of vascular disease, of vascular narrowing, then it would make sense that you understand very, very well why diabetics have to worry about more blindness. Because it causes these small vessels in the back of the eye to become no longer optimally functional. Atherosclerosis, a narrowing of the vascular structures. And so when it comes to diabetes, blindness, nuke blindness, is the number one cause in our society. Of all blindness, it is diabetes. Number two, diabetics usually have a much higher risk for developing renal disease, kidney disease. As a matter of fact, it's 18 times higher. And now you see everywhere in Western society, and even in Dominica now, in the Caribbean islands, they're building diabetes treatment centers that focus on dialysis units. Huge profit margins there. Shouldn't we be more concerned in turning the disease off than managing the disease? And then you have to be concerned about heart disease and stroke, which is increased by 2 to 4 times for diabetics. Diabetics, as I mentioned already, impotence is a real factor for men there. And then you have to be concerned about amputations. First your toe, then your foot, then your leg. I've seen it over and over again. It's a number one cause of non-industrial amputations, foot and leg amputations. Then, of course, you have to worry about hearing loss. Because again, these small vessels that are supposed to bring nutritional content to the inner ear affected. You have to think in terms of the intracerebral vessels becoming narrowed down. So now you have to worry about stroke. You have to worry about cognitive processes. You have to worry about Alzheimer's disease. You have to worry about senility. You have to worry about memory loss. These are all related to diabetes. Diabetics are affected by a disease that some of us call the mother of all chronic diseases. And when people get the diagnosis of diabetes, it's like a death knell, like a death sentence. You know it's over, especially if you're educated and you know what it does, the complications. You also know that when it comes to life expectancy is significantly reduced. For instance, if you are diagnosed at the age of 40 years with diabetes, you're a man, you will lose about 11.6 years. For a woman, it's about 14.3 years. I mean, these are terrifying realities. And yet, it doesn't have to be that way. I have some good news for you now. And that is, you can reverse this disease. You can reverse disease in weeks, in most cases, if you're willing to make some simple lifestyle changes, like moving towards a diet that's plant-based and whole food. And where most of your calories come from starch. Did you hear me? Starch, I cannot eat starch. I'm a diabetic. It will turn into sugar. No, no way. Yes, but I'll show you later on. It's not the starch per se, but it's the unrefined starch. The way how food comes to us in nature, that's the magical friend for diabetics. When you get enough fiber into your system as it comes with starchy foods like beans, they're wonderful if you want to reverse diabetes. If you want to do something about diabetes, begin to eat more foods that have not only soluble but also insoluble fiber, like whole grains. I'm not talking about grains. I mean, that's donuts and cakes and pies. No, I'm talking about whole grains, like whole wheat. I'm talking about corn on the cob. I'm talking about spelt. I'm talking about these kind of foods as they come to us in nature where you don't really need a nutrition label. Nature didn't make too many mistakes. But we take a perfect product and we refine it for profitability and perhaps palatability. And we seduce the people, and the diseases emerge. Here's Dr. James Anderson, one of the foremost researchers in the area of diabetes. You know, he's written over 500 scientific articles and books. A personal friend of mine. And he said, Hans, some 50 to 75% of these type 2 diabetics on insulin, and 80 or 90% of those on pills could normalize their blood sugars and be off medication within weeks if they changed their diet. He said that at a national conference in Loma Linda University in 1980, and he published it and published it and published it, but somehow nobody listens. We're pushing the drugs. Easy answer. Oh, don't worry about changing your diet. I mean, just take some extra. Enjoy your food. Do whatever you want. If your blood sugar goes up, just take some extra insulin. You'll be fine. No. We need a paradigm shift. We need to move from medicine to lifestyle medicine, where we provide education and motivation and inspiration, ideally in a community setting, so where people find they have support. It's swimming against the current of the culture. And I always tell my patients, you are good. I mean, just think about this. Yes, you have to swim against the current of the culture, but only dead fish swim with the current. So when it comes to diabetes, let's just take a little bit of a review here. You see here on the screen, this is a person without diabetes. We have a pancreas. And the pancreas produces a special hormone called insulin, and that insulin goes to every one of your 100 trillion cells within seconds when it's being released to open the cellular gates so that the sugar in the blood can go into the cell and drive the activities of the cell. The cell is like a tank, and you need to have the gas to come in to run the engine. Are you with me there? Okay, now, this is now a person with type 1 diabetes. It's a special kind of diabetes. It's usually found mostly in younger people. Type 1 diabetes, here you see what is missing in that person. Take a look. Well, the pancreas is there, but it doesn't produce any insulin. So if you don't have any insulin, you don't have any door opener to the cells to usher in the glucose, the sugar, and take it out of the blood and move it into the cell where it's needed. This is the issue. You need to have glucose in your cell to run the machinery. That's the energy. That's the gas in the tank. That person does not produce insulin. There'll be no door opening effect. The doors are shut. The blood sugar builds up in the bloodstream, and the person ends up in a coma. It's usually ultimately deadly. And so these people are dependent on external insulin that's being injected on a regular basis. And they can live fairly normal lives, particularly if they avoid the complications of the American diet and move towards a diet that is centered on plant foods and whole foods. Then you have type 2 diabetes. And here, of course, you have an overactive pancreas. I mean, this poor target organ is working overtime. in trying to push out enough insulin and more insulin and more insulin to try to open up the gates of those cells. And yet somehow the cells don't always open up. There's something wrong with the hinges on the door. Maybe they're rusty. Or maybe there's some communication problem within the cell where the signal doesn't go out. Open up the doors. I need energy. And so you can see here, the glucose, the blood sugar, is building up on the outside of the cell, and the cell, in the midst of plenty, is actually beginning to starve for the gas in the tank, the glucose. So this is what we call insulin insensitivity. We talk about a disease here where there is enough insulin available. This is different from type 1. You have plenty of insulin when a person is diagnosed initially with diabetes. There's plenty of insulin, but the insulin somehow doesn't work. It doesn't do the job adequately well. There's something wrong with the hinges. There's something wrong with the intracellular signaling and so on. Well, you're already aware now that there are at least two kinds of diabetes, right? Type 1 and, yeah, you understand that. But then there's a third kind, gestational, that happens during pregnancy. And one of the lecturers here talked about perhaps a diabetes that might be related to radiation. These are the three big ones that we usually talk about. The biggest one, obviously, the most prevalent one, is type 2 diabetes. Usually happens when people are 60, 70 years of age. That's what I was taught. And that was correct in the 1970s. But things have changed. Today, we're instructing our medical students, listen, when you do a physical, be sure you look for an increase in blood sugar. In 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds, yes, but also in 50-year-olds, in 40-year-olds, in 30-year-olds, in 20-year-olds, in 15-year-olds, because now this disease that was restricted largely to the elderly now is found in the juveniles. In the 1970s, when we saw a 15-year-old with an increased blood sugar, we said, oh, he must be a type 1 diabetic. No more. It's a very scary thing, which also debunks the idea that we have so much diabetes because we're living longer. No, it's not that. Because this disease is now reaching out into the younger side of our population too. And what do? We manage the symptoms. We don't cure diabetes. So we have 3 million people on insulin. We have another 2 million on insulin and pills. And then we have 13 million people on pills for the rest of their lives. That's a great income stream for companies that produce these drugs. For life. That's the ideal disease to have. For life, for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Pills. Do they turn the disease around? Let's talk about that. And then on top of this, if you don't take those medications, then people with good intentions place you on a diet. So you have 3 million people on diets that are usually low-carb diets. Are you with me? Which means they're actually then high in animal products, right? Because if you don't have carbs, you have to have fat and protein. So they often place these people usually on low-fat meat diets, chicken, lean beef, these kind of things, that all have their own problems and actually accelerate the process of complications, especially as it relates to atherosclerotic processes, because cholesterol is only found in animal products. And the number one source of saturated fat, which drives the liver to make excessive amounts of cholesterol. The saturated fat comes from cheese and animal products such as meats, fish, and fowl. You see, we're always trying to fix things after the fact. I mean, obviously, these pipes are leaking. Folks, what do you think we ought to do? Pass out umbrellas? That's what we do in medicine. We pass out $100 umbrellas. We charge for these enormous amounts, but we are not really changing the problem. We got to attack the causes. And the causes with these chronic diseases largely reside within ourselves. It resides within the culture. We need a cultural transformation to handle these problems and to turn them off at the very base, at the very cause. Are you with me? Yeah, good. So here are some concerns that we have when it comes to using these pharmacological approaches. Do we taking care of the symptoms or do we taking care of the causes? And we all recognize that drugs don't cure, they don't stop the epidemic, and they actually may be harmful. Many of these diabetes drugs, they are brought into the awareness of the medical profession with a huge advertising budget, and the drugs are around for 2, 3, 4 years, and then the complications set in. Then we begin to realize there are side effects that are deadly, and before you know it, the drug dies without any fanfare. It's gone. And then the next drug comes. And we have the same experience. It happened to Resolin, which was a very powerful, well-promoted drug, and within 5, 6 years, too many deaths as a side effect of the drug, and they disappear. Now you have Avandia. That's a drug that is very commonly used in America, and again, there are class action suits being filed against the manufacturer of this drug. They're no longer being used, from what I understand, in Europe now, so there are problems there. They come and they go. And then what most people don't realize when they have diabetes, they don't really understand why they're gaining weight. I mean, they're doing their very, very best to cut back on foods, and yet they're gaining weight. They have a huge appetite, and they don't understand why. They don't understand that almost all the drugs, except for one, including insulin injections, all of these medicinal pharmacological approaches, except for one drug, metformin, will have a side effect that's caused appetite enhancement. What does that do? You want to eat more. You're hungry as a result of the drugs, of the insulin. So you want to eat more. So you eat more, you gain more weight. You gain more weight, your blood sugars go up. So you have to have more medication. The medication causes side effects. It enhances your appetite. So you eat more. You have higher blood sugar levels, you have to have more medication. Do you see the vicious cycle that we're in? Yeah. So what can we do? We know from international data that many populations that used a traditional plant-based diet were basically immune to diabetes. It was difficult to find diabetes in societies where people lived on very simple foods. But as we have a globalization of the Western diet, the disease also globalizes. We expect in the next 15 years to see the progression of type 2 diabetes in developing countries to increase by 170%. I mean, we are introducing these kind of problems into non-suspecting nations and countries because they all have seen it on television, the American lifestyle. You live like an American, you die like an American. You are undermining the quality of life, especially of the last 10 years of your life. We're only number 42 in life expectancy in the world, and yet we're spending twice as much money on medical care than the next nation. Health does not come with monetary expenditures. Health comes as a byproduct of encouraging, educating, motivating, inspiring populations. And that has to include policy changes by governments. We need to make it the right thing to eat more simply. We have to make it the right thing to go into an exercise program. Diabetics, any diabetic, should, after a meal, should immediately walk. I don't mean in half an hour, I mean within 2 minutes. That's the latest finding that we have now. We need to be in an exercise program immediately after every meal. If it's just 10 minutes, it's fine, because you blunt the spiking of the blood sugar. Let's look at the dietary aspects here. And we can take you to Japan. You see, Japan, not only received MacArthur, but also McDonald's. Fast foods. They became all the rage in Japan. It was difficult to find heart disease in Japan after World War II. I mean, the story is told that the Tokyo University Medical School had to import atherosclerosed coronary arteries from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore to show medical students in Japan what killed then every second American from heart disease. Within 25 years, Japan no longer had to import and purchase these samples to demonstrate. They became self-sufficient with heart disease in response to a westernization of their diet. Here you look at diabetes now. 1960, it was very difficult to find type 2 diabetes in Japan. Within 20 years, the increase had been demonstrated 1 to 5% instead of just 1% before. And then 20 years later, you have now diabetes at the rate of 6 to 12%. And since then, the epidemic of diabetes is in Japan. 15% of the people over 40 years of age now have diabetes. You couldn't find the disease 60 years ago in Japan. Why? What happened? Westernization, especially the diet. Here you take a look at the rise in fat consumption. 1960, about 20 grams of fat. Today, it's more like 60 grams of fat. So fat has increased by 3 times. At the same time, you see a dramatic decline in the amount of carbohydrates. When we talk about carbohydrates, we're talking largely about the prominent carbohydrates at that time in Japan: rice, a starch, a complex carbohydrates. And you can see the dramatic decline. And isn't it interesting, as the fat goes up, the carbs go down, the weight goes up. You see the red line? And with that, you see in parallel motion the increase in diabetes. Diabetes and obesity, they're sort of clinical cousins. They're in tandem. They're working together. And so one of the areas where we can do something to prevent and reverse is to begin to lower our weight, and with that, the number of calories that we take in. This is the American diet. I mean, look at this one here. And this is an old data. This is 10, 12 years ago. Per week, we spend $350. And look at the foods that we have. Do you see any foods that don't have nutrition labels? Do you see any whole foods there? It's a rarity, isn't it? You think it's almost lost in the picture there. And so I want to raise a very important question, because we have said for too long that diabetes has to do with too many carbs. It's all the sugar. Everybody knows it's a sugar bowl that is causing diabetes. It all goes back to the pharaohs 3,000 years ago, who were examined by their priest physicians. Well, they didn't really examine the pharaoh. They just asked the pharaoh to provide some urine. And then they would pour it on the ground. And if the ants would be attracted by the urine of the pharaoh, then your royalty, your majesty, it sounds like you have a sweet disease. You have diabetes. And somehow this idea that sugar is the cause of diabetes has still been lingering with us ever since. So the question I want to raise now is it really related to sugar, or could it be something else? Could it relate to the amount of fat in the diet? Could it relate to the lack of fiber in the diet? And so I want to take you down to the 1920s. Here's a physician, and this physician was able to create transient diabetes in medical students within less than 2 weeks. What do you think they did? They fed them a high-fat diet. Dr. Anderson did a similar experiment more recently, where he took medical students and he gave them 1 pound of sugar a day embedded into the regular diet. The kids just loved it. After 11 weeks, not one of these healthy medical students had tested diabetic. 11 weeks, 1 pound of sugar embedded in the diet. Then he said, okay, let me introduce now a high-fat diet to the students, and he gave them everything that had fat. I mean, they would drink cream with coffee, not coffee with cream. They would have butter. They would have the mayonnaise. They would have the meats. They would have the wieners. Anything that you could have that has lots of fat and fiber and oil in it, they would get it. And the kids thought they are really going to heaven now. In less than 2 weeks, 70% of the medical students tested diabetic. Could fat perhaps be involved here? Have we overlooked something? 1935, Sir Harold Himsworth, a famous medical practitioner in England, did some control experiments, and he was able to change the blood sugars by just manipulating the amount of fat in the diet. Cut back on the oils and the grease and the fat, eat more foods that don't have these high fat intakes, and the blood sugars came down, and the medications had to be reduced. Now you say, well, that was maybe a long time ago, but what about today? Well, let me take you to Colorado, to the San Luis Valley. In the 1990s, this research group took 134 pre-diabetics. These were usually people that were overweight. And then they followed them for 3 years very carefully, and they found that the most prominent predictor for the emergence of full-blown diabetes over the next 3 years was the amount of fat in the diet of these people. Those people that had the highest amount of fat in their diet became the most prominently and fastest growing full-blown diabetics. As a matter of fact, they found that as little as 40 grams of fat, that would be about 2 ounces of fat. 40 grams of fat a day increased the risk for becoming a full-blown diabetic by 60%. I take you to Harvard now, the famous Harvard nurses study, 85,000 pre-diabetics. They followed them for 16 years. And out of these 85,000 pre-diabetics, 3,300 became full-blown diabetics. And here's what they found. They said, why did these 3,300 people, pre-diabetics, turn into diabetics? What was the significant factor here? And they found that 91% related to the choice of their lifestyle. And amidst that lifestyle, nothing was more important than overweight. As a matter of fact, when they looked at the people that became diabetics and those who did not, it was the weight issue that became most prominent. Because when they looked at the lowest weight with those diabetics that had the highest weight had a 40-fold relative risk. That means they had a 40 times more likelihood that they would become diabetics over that 16-year period. Overweight, obesity. And then you have the famous diabetes prevention program called the DPP. Here's what they did. It's an outstanding, solid study. They had 3,000 some obese pre-diabetics. They set up a study for 3 years, and in the study, they used many, many different universities and centers to generate this kind of a data of 3,000 obese pre-diabetic patients. And here's what they found. They instructed the centers randomize some of the people into a control group, don't do anything in terms of dietary change. Another group, give them metformin, the most prominent drug that we use for diabetes management. That's the second group. And a third group, put them on a simple lifestyle program. And then follow them for the next 3 years. What was the lifestyle change like? Simple things, like lose about 7% of your excess weight. It's not a big deal, is it? In our CHIP program, we have our people lose 8 pounds in 4 weeks, and they eat more than they've ever eaten in their lives because they eat the right foods. When you have foods that are high in fiber, you can eat more, as you know. You can eat more, you can fill that pouch, it holds 4 cups of food, and you're going to be fine. You're full, you're fine, and you have low calories because of the nature of what you put in. So 7% weight loss, and they accomplished that. And they said, we want you to exercise, we want you to walk 150 minutes a week. Is that a lot? That's 20 minutes a day. I mean, that's about walk half an hour a day. So they told these patients, these obese pre-diabetics, we want you to walk every day, 6 times a week for half an hour, and we want you to do something to lose some of your weight, 7% of your extra weight. And here's the results. 29% of these pre-diabetics, they had not yet developed diabetes, 29% who just did what they always did, they followed their doctor's orders, 29% became full-blown diabetics. Those patients on metformin, only 21% became full-blown diabetics. So the drug has an advantage over doing nothing of significance. But then they looked at the results of the lifestyle group. And here they found that only 14% of these people actually became full-blown diabetics, which means that lifestyle trumps medication when it comes to type 2 diabetes. The evidence is very clear. There's no debate out there, but nobody seems to be doing it. Because a physician has 10 minutes time to diagnose the ill, match it with a pill, and send you home with a bill. 10 minutes. Next one. What are you going to do in 10 minutes? You cannot educate people in 10 minutes. I want you to lose weight. Do you know how to do it? No. We have learned that you need 30, 40 hours of group-supported education that's delivered in a caring, loving environment to stimulate behavior change. And when that happens, these diseases become powerfully impacted. Here's another study at Harvard, again, 200,000 people followed for 10 years, and they found that 2 ounces of processed red meat, these are the sausages, these are the strips of bacon, these kind of things, at as little as 2 ounces of processed red meat a day would increase diabetes by 50%. Powerful. When they replaced some of the meat with lentils and beans and whole grains, the diabetes rate actually decreased by 35%. The power of the fork and knife. How do we use it? I want to take you now to Loma Linda University. Loma Linda is the center of one of the most highly regarded population studies called the Adventist Health Study. When you go to medical conventions and people talk about lifestyle diseases, they will always, it seems, refer to the Adventist Health Study. These are people that basically don't use alcohol. These are a conservative Christian group of people that don't use alcohol, they don't smoke. They go to church once a week fairly regularly. The exercise habits are fairly similar. They have a good social support network. So they're very unified. It doesn't matter what's in Loma Linda. They talk about the Loma Linda Blue Zone. It's not the Loma Linda Blue Zone. It's the Adventist Blue Zone, because wherever you go in the world where Adventists are, and there are about, 20 million or so, they tell me, you will have the same results. Because they don't smoke, they don't use alcohol, they have a good social network, they have spiritual orientation, they go to church regularly, they're practicing a similar homogeneous lifestyle, except the Adventist people around the world don't have homogeneity and similarity in their diet that they choose. Because some of the Adventists are meat eaters, about 50% of them are. 10% are vegetarian fish eaters. Are you with me there? They don't eat meat, but they eat fish. About 10% are total vegetarians, pure vegetarians, vegans. And about 30% of them are lacto-ovo-vegetarians. So you're with me there? So it's a group of homogeneous, lifestyle-oriented people, except in the area of diet. And the government has been very, very interested in asking the question, now tell us, what is really the role of diet? Here you have people that have a similar lifestyle. You have no confounders there. Why don't you look at the difference that perhaps the difference in diet can make on health outcomes? And here's what they found when it comes to diabetes. The red bar represents the Adventists, the meat eaters. 6.3% of them have diabetes that is being treated. But on the other hand, when you go down to the yellow color. These are now the lacto-vegetarians. They have 2.2%. So moving from a meat-centered diet towards a lacto-vegetarian diet has tremendous benefits. We need to recognize that. Some people are very, very committed, almost fanatically, to veganism. I think we have to recognize that not everybody can change all at once, and we have to begin to say, let's move in the right direction, help people to make the initial step, move towards fish. Yes, it's not ideal food, but it's still better than the other foods. And the evidence is very clear from the Adventist Health Study that when you move in that direction, like you see the blue color there, 3% of the people that are fish eaters but vegetarians have now diabetes. So they're better than the meat-eating Adventist people. But the very best results you will have when you go to a plant-based diet, a pure vegetarian diet. And I suspect that the results might even be better if we had some data on these 100,000 people in this study. If we would know something about their intake of processed foods. This is not just looking at one wing of the airplane, moving towards a plant-based diet. But there's another wing that we have to look at, and that is whole foods versus processed foods. So the chances are probably that's even higher. Now, the question then comes up, what about reversing diabetes? Can we reverse diabetes? And here again, these are some powerful examples of how we have ignored historic data. We have this idea that if it didn't come out of this current issue of 2015, who knows what they did in those days? Well, let me take a look. 1933, Montreal, Dr. Rabinovich, 5-year control experiment. He takes 100 people on insulin. They're diabetics, obviously, and he tells them, I want you to eat a diet that's very low in fat. Now, at that time, people used to eat 40% fat diets, and he said, I want you to go less than 20%. And he said, eat more whole foods. 1933. And out of these 100 insulin-using type 2 diabetics, 24 were off insulin within weeks. A big indicator that 24% of our patients at that time could be off medication by doing what?
Low fat.
Moving towards a low-fat diet, a very low-fat diet. Which you do by increasing natural foods as grown, which means they also have more fiber. So there are many, many nutritional factors that come together that coalesce in creating this kind of a therapeutic outcome. 1955, Inder Singh. Well, he said, I wondered what Dr. Rabinovich did in those years. I want to see if I can duplicate this. This is how science works. You duplicate, you do it again. You want to see how it works in different population groups. And as that happens and the data comes out fairly consistently, you become more and more convinced that there's something to that. There are always sometimes little studies that show up, and sometimes big studies that have contrasting results. And that's sometimes that cherry-picking ideologists focus on. We have to look at all the data. So here's Inder Singh. And he wonders what happens. And he took 80 patients on insulin. And by the way, some of these patients were classified as what we would call today type 1 diabetics. And we are very clear that type 1 diabetics always have to remain on external insulin injections, right? Because the pancreas doesn't produce any insulin. Well, he had some type 1 diabetics in this group who may have not been developing that disease very early on, so that the pancreas was still producing some insulin. But the majority of these patients were all type 2 diabetics. And he placed them on an 11% fat diet. Now remember, I said to you that the average fat consumption was about 40%. In the 1950s, it was even more than that. So he put them on an 11% fat diet. You heard of Ornish? You heard of Esselstyn? People that have been involved in reversing heart disease, they used 7 to 10% fat diets. This is Singh doing this in 1955. Nothing new under the sun, right? Experimenting. And what he found was that out of the 80 patients on insulin, 50 were off insulin in 6 weeks. I mean, think about this. People that are condemned to all these diseases that we talked about, the complications affecting the brain, affecting the ears, the eyes, affecting the heart, affecting the male sex organ, affecting the whole body. Within 6 weeks, 50 out of 80 people, 62% were off these insulin injections. Why don't we do this? I mean, this is data that's published in one of the most prestigious medical journals, the Lancet journal that comes out of England. This is not just a study on 5 rats. This is a well-documented study. And this is not the only one. I could have cited you study after study after study. Let me try to do this. World War II. The Nazi armies overrun Scandinavia. And they take all the livestock and feed it to the soldiers. And the local population becomes healthy. Now, that was not, I mean, the Nazis were not public health advocates. But that's what happened. Diabetes dropped way down. Heart disease dropped way down. High blood pressure dropped way down. Overweight dropped way down. And people said, well, it's just a fluke. And they said, well, let's wait and see what happens after the war. When this war is over, we should take a look at this. As people return back to their normal, usual lifestyle, with the livestock and so on, what would happen then? And guess what happened? 10 years later, the diseases were back. We never learned our lesson. Here's Dr. James Anderson from the University of Kentucky. I mentioned him earlier to you. He took 28 patients on insulin, and what he did, he gave them a high fiber, a high starch diet. Unrefined starch. And very, very low fat, 10%. He was inspired by Nathan Pritikin, who also worked for the 10% fat diet. And I happened to be there as the director of research and education at the time. So I met Dr. Anderson, and we had good discussions there. And he said, Hans, let me try it out at the University of Kentucky and see what happens there. So he took 28 diabetic patients on insulin, and he gave them a high fiber, a high starch, a very low fat diet, basically vegetarian, vegan diet. And here you see the results. 22 out of the 28 patients had to have the insulin removed within 3 weeks. I mean, think about this. This has been done over and over again. Here's the Pritikin program. 74% of the patients with type 2 diabetes on oral drugs left the center free of any diabetes medication. They were new people. And all they did, they exercised every day. They became inspired by understanding the disease. They learned how to prepare simpler foods, healthier foods, and they began to enjoy the foods. It just takes about 2 to 3 weeks to get used to the food. You make the taste adjustments. It happens very nicely, very easily, and 6 months later, as you follow this lifestyle, you cannot stand it to have these hyper-palatable foods that we're all addicted to. All of a sudden, the Snicker bars no longer has the appeal because something has happened. The cerebral phase, the cognitive phase has changed. You interpret these kind of things. The taste is interpreted differently because of what you know. And so the answer to these chronic diseases has to be found in education, motivation, understanding, and provided with social support so we can help each other until we're strong enough to face the world and the culture. Are you with me? I was in Australia. I met Dr. Karen O'Dea. And she said, Hans, we did an interesting experiment. We looked at some Aboriginal people. They're usually on a very simple diet, but then they come to Sydney, and over the next 10, 20 years, many of them turn into diabetics. So we picked 10 diabetics. They used to be in the outback before, but now they've become civilized Australians. They were eating like Australians, and they had developed diabetes. And he said, I sent them back to where they used to live. And I said, whatever you find, you eat it, it's yours. So they began to eat kangaroo meat, which is only 13% fat. I mean, the American sirloin steak is about 70%. So this is a very low-fat kangaroo, meat that they picked up there. But they also were eating roots, high-starch foods, and berries, and fruits. They were diabetics. They ate fruits and roots and kangaroos. And within 7 weeks, their insulin normalized and their blood sugars dropped dramatically. 7 out of 10 of these new civilized diabetics no longer had to worry about being diabetics, as long as they followed a very simple diet. When you're diabetic and you have now a reversibility, it doesn't mean that you can do anything from now on. No, you've got to stay on the program for life. Otherwise, it doesn't. You lose the benefits, obviously. Here's Dr. Diehl Barnard, excellent work. He, again, used a very simple diet. Foods has grown, whole foods, and 71% of his diabetic patients were able to stop their pills in his 26-day program. Here's the results from our program that we did 2 years ago, the randomized controlled trial that I talked to you about. This is all within 12 weeks. Because of the reduction in hemoglobin A1C, because of the reduction in blood sugars, these people, on average, there are 44 in this group, their nerve damage risk declined by 67%. Their vision loss, going blind, the chance of going blind was reduced by 67%. The likelihood of developing kidney disease reduced again by 67%. The chances of an amputation for these diabetics was reduced by 77%. And diabetes-related death reduced by 38%. Just think about this. This is 12 weeks, and you dramatically lower the likelihood of all these complications that are life-threatening. What do these diets all have in common that are identified as being involved in the reversibility of diabetes type 2? Well, aside from the exercise that we recommend, here's a dietary thing. You want to use a diet that is plant-based, it's whole food oriented. Which means that it should be very low in fat. Because a plant-based diet is usually low in fat, unless you add a lot of oils and so on to it. You want to perhaps not go as low as some people do, say that you need to be below the 10% mark. Maybe some people need to do that that are in a dire therapeutic need kind of a situation. But by and large, when it comes to diabetes, we want people to have a low-fat diet, animal products 0, but have the fats come from nuts and seeds, avocados. Not in large amounts. They're very nutritious foods. They're excellent. But use them in small amounts, maybe half a handful every day. Some nuts, walnuts, chia seeds, these kind of things. Flaxseed, excellent. Every morning. In my home, we will have 1 or 2 tablespoons of freshly ground flaxseed over our hot cereal. Excellent. So low fat, less than 20%, very low in saturated fat, which usually comes from animal products and cheese. And we don't want any trans fats, which you usually find in processed foods, right? No cholesterol, it's a vegetarian diet. High fiber, we want to see 30, 40, 50 grams of fiber. Fiber is your best friend, and the very best food for a diabetic to eat is to focus on beans, beans, beans. Oh, I know you worry about the social aspects. You don't have to worry about that. It settles down after 3-4 weeks. It will pass. Don't worry. It'll be okay. And then you have a diet here now that is very high in antioxidants. It's very high in phytochemicals. You have learned that there are probably over 100,000 phytochemicals in nature. They're all found only exclusively in plant foods. And they all have a special role to play in keeping our bodies, our enzyme systems working in optimal fashion. You follow this kind of a diet, you get maximum amount of phytochemicals. Exactly what you need. And then, of course, the density of calories is very, very low. You can eat as much as you want because you cannot overeat. Because the fiber, the roughage, prevents you from overeating calorically. Are you with me there? I mean, it's a wonderful thing of how this is all playing out very well together. And of course, you can reduce your food bill by 35 to 45%. Is that okay? Is that okay? I mean, that was a pretty meager response here. You can reduce your food bill by 35 to 45%. We guarantee that to you. Yes. But you have to move towards plant-based and less processed foods, because that's where you spend your money. And you have to also think about eating more at home than eating out. And you can do it very easily. Just get a crock pot, get a slow cooker. It's easy to do, no problem. We'll teach you how to do it. Go to our website, CHIP Health, C-H-I-P. Health. CHIP stands, we recommend more potato chips, more... No, CHIP stands for Complete Health Improvement Program. And there are some 70,000 graduates all over the place, and the program is run in many, many cities by way of videos. Now, I should say, as we begin to close, the science is all there. What is not there is the political will. The science is incontrovertible that diabetes is largely a self-made disease that is culturally promoted. And the answer is not to put out more medications for the treatment of the symptoms in managing this disease. The answer has to be found in finding ways to provide energy to people, to give people hope, just like with Kathy. I don't think this is going to last. It's too good to be true. I've been on insulin all these years, and now all of a sudden, in just 4 weeks, I'm down from 32 units down to 7 units. Will this last? Yes, it will, as long as you follow through. Epidemiologists have long known that the major determinants of our killer diseases are dietary and lifestyle factors. Make your fork and your knife your friends. Use this fork and knife in the most effective way, because if you don't, they turn into weapons of mass destruction. So the greatest challenge that we have today in medicine is, how do we motivate physicians to look beyond what they've been trained to do? To get into the concepts of lifestyle medicine, to look at nutrition and exercise and psychology and how to communicate with people, how to motivate people. And the other thing, of course, is the challenge before us is, how do you motivate people to make changes? Because my colleagues said, well, nobody wants to change anyway, so I'm not going to waste my time. I've only 10 minutes to see a patient. There's nothing I can do in that. I can only prescribe the medication. Next one, please. We can change. But it takes more than 10 minutes. And part of that armamentarium is out there. Part of that is the CHIP program. It's a complete health improvement program. It's community-based. It's intensive education in groups. It's 12 weeks long, 18 sessions, 40 hours. Well documented. Just to give you a few data here, and we looked at some 525 diabetics. They were not on medication, but they were over 125 points, right? That's a diabetic. So there were 525. We did this study on 5,000 CHIP graduates. Okay, so this is not based on 5 people. This is well documented, and it's published in the American Journal of Cardiology. So there were 525 diabetics, and then look, within 30 days, there were no longer 525, but only 301 diabetics. So I asked a medical group in a large auditorium, I said, what do you think happened to these diabetics? They went from 525 to 301. And one deadpan, they died. No, they didn't die. They're no longer diabetics. But it seems to be so incomprehensible to many of our medical colleagues that you can actually stop diabetes in its tracks if you help people to change their diet and their lifestyle. So I want to give you an example. In the last 10 minutes we have.
Hello, I'm Dr. Roger Greenlaw, and I would like to share with you a story from my practice. We'll be hearing about the health benefits of a high-fiber diet in a 76-year-old woman with multiple lifestyle-related diseases.
It had started several years ago, maybe 25, 30 years ago. I began gaining weight. That's the first thing I noticed. And with that weight gain, I developed some high blood pressure. And soon the doctors were talking to me about high cholesterol. And not too long after that, I started to develop what I thought were cardiovascular symptoms. I was very, very tired. I couldn't walk very much of a distance before I had to sit down. I would be out of breath. Very soon after that, I developed symptoms of diabetes. After several years of that, I started to have even more complications that come with high blood pressure and diabetes. I started to have eye problems, what they call diabetic retinopathy. So I did go to a nephrologist, and he suggested that my kidney function tests indicated that I was going into kidney failure. In fact, I was at stage 4. Which sort of puts you right at the edge of needing dialysis and or a kidney transplant. Finally, one Sunday, I lost vision in my right eye, and at the same time had a problem with my right arm. There was some pain there, and I couldn't use it very easily. So then they ran more serious tests and finally did an angiogram. And at that time, they found many, 7 or 8 blood vessels that needed to be replaced. And then went out to tell my husband and daughter they would have to do open heart surgery and take veins from my leg and replace those blocked blood vessels in my heart. And they did that in short order. In addition to what I saw as very serious health problems, I did start to develop some digestive problems along the way. And I took some over-the-counter type medications for that, and it didn't seem to help much. So by the time that I made an appointment to see Dr. Greenlaw and talk about the colonoscopy, I also had many other digestive problems to discuss.
Now I would like to tell you about the medications that Beverly was taking. She was on 4 different medications for high blood pressure. One of them causes potassium to be lost from the body, so she was also taking a potassium supplement. In addition, she was on a trial of Lipitor for cholesterol elevation. Let's focus for a moment on Beverly's diabetes. She was insulin dependent, not only taking long-acting insulin every day, but several times during the day, she required injections of regular insulin to control her blood sugars. And remember, she had complications of her diabetes.
I had so many things that I really didn't know what to work on next to try to keep under control. I was so worried about myself and how I was feeling and what I was going to do if this thing progressed, or if I couldn't get those kidneys under control, or if the veins that they had replaced the arteries with in my heart blocked again. So I really was in a hopeless situation, and I knew I had to make some firm decisions and life changes.
In our discussions, it was obvious to Beverly, and it was obvious to me, that she had exhausted all the traditional medical interventions that could help with her diseases and complications. She was asking me, what could I do that would improve my situation? Now, we talked about lifestyle change, her nutrition, her exercise, what stresses were going on in her life. And could she make some changes that might begin to address her diseases? And she was interested. I recommended that she try the CHIP program, and she agreed. As Beverly and I talked about lifestyle change, therapeutic lifestyle change, we talked about her multiple diseases and how the CHIP program could address all of those. The idea that if you treat one problem with a lifestyle change, you begin to treat all problems simultaneously that are lifestyle related. And that seemed like a perfect idea for Beverly's situation. Now for the really fun part of this story. Beverly signed up to take the CHIP program in September and October of 2009, and I would like to share with you some of her laboratory data. In the beginning, her cholesterol was 263, and after the CHIP program, it was down to 170. When we looked out 5 months later, it was 202, and a year after that, 178. It is not unusual for people's numbers to improve with some ups and downs over time, and she has continued to improve. Notice her weight loss at the end of the CHIP program was 15 pounds, 5 months later, 25 pounds, and then in February, a year later, 40 pounds off, and in June of 2012, 57 pounds off, and that's where she leveled out. Notice the dress size going from 18 to 16 to 14 and then 12, and now she's shopping in the size 8 to 10 rack.
Then I noticed that I could eat a great deal without taking more insulin. The other thing I noticed is I seem to be losing weight, eating more, but losing weight. And that gave me some encouragement. I think probably just in the first weeks, I lost 10 pounds or more. As I became more involved with the program, I noticed that I could get the blood sugar levels under control. That was a big thing for me. And I was feeling a lot better.
The big story here is that she's off insulin and controlling her diabetes with metformin and lifestyle change alone. And let's not forget that Beverly was suffering from severe complications of her diabetes. With the taking of the CHIP program, the laser treatments stopped. And over the next 2 or 3 years, not one laser treatment was necessary. Her ophthalmologist was stunned at that result because that is so seldom seen in traditional medicine.
Then the neuropathy, that was a problem. In the auditorium where we had our CHIP program, there were steps. And every time we went to our seats or got up to get water or have a break, we would use those steps. And I needed help a lot of the times because I couldn't feel the steps. The steps themselves in my feet, with my feet. If I couldn't see them, I wouldn't know they were there. And so someone noticed and gave me some help when I needed to get up out of my seat. And now it's so different because even if I change socks and I have heavier socks on or lighter socks, I can feel the fibers in the socks, and it was something I couldn't feel before. Just recently, the doctor checked my feet with the little wire to see how your neuropathy is, if it's progressing, and he could find no evidence of it at all.
Neuropathy is something most people would say is not able to be improved by medical therapy. You would use pain medicine to control the discomfort, but you would not expect neuropathy to go away. And in Beverly's case, her neuropathy steadily improved till it is now no longer an issue in her life. Incidentally, her heartburn improved within 2 weeks of starting the CHIP program.
I would have been happy before I started CHIP if any of the diseases that I've talked about would have been helped, even to any degree. That's how desperate I was. And now I see that not only the diseases were, some of them reversed, all of them improved, that's for sure, but it changed me as a person. I see myself sort of as CEO and president and chairman of the board of all the decisions that are made for my body and do everything I can to make the right decisions day by day.
You see, nothing has undergone more changes in American therapeutics when it comes to diet than the changes that have been recommended by the American Diabetes Association. 1921, take a look. They recommended a diet that was 70% fat, 10% protein, and 20% carbohydrates because the idea was you cannot take carbohydrates. It's a sugar that is causing the problem, therefore no carbohydrates. So if you don't eat carbohydrates, what's left? Fat and protein. And so, but gradually you see the change that took place, 1950, 1971, 1986. Now we're recommending we should have less than 30% of the fat of our diet in terms of fat. And we are still recommending now a high protein diet, which is 10 to 20%. Most of us in the research field think that this is much too high because this is what's contributing to the kidney disease, because the kidneys have to process the nitrogen that you find in the protein. So here's the CHIP program. Here are some of the concepts that have been used by Nathan Pritikin, that have been used by Dr. Barnard, that have been used by many of these people like Dr. Esselstyn and so on. We recommend that when people want to do something about their type 2 diabetes, cut back on your fat as much as you can. If you get down to 20%, you're on the right track. If you get down to 15, maybe it's even better. And then we recommend be sure you're on a relatively moderate, maybe even low protein diet, because the protein is very, very hard to take by the kidney, which is under attack because of diabetes. And then we recommend take in 75% of your calories or thereabouts in starch, in carbohydrates, in fruits, because there's some sugar there, which is a carbohydrate. So in closing, I want you to really understand the big issue here, and that is when carbohydrate foods are protected by fiber, they're totally differently processed, digested, and assimilated than if you have unprotected carbohydrates. What is protecting these carbohydrate foods? The fiber. Fiber is your best friend when it comes to helping diabetics. Soluble fiber, as you find in beans or oats, and also in the other kind of fiber that you find in whole grains, the insoluble one. So remember that processed starch that is unprotected, processed starch, refined starch, turns into sugar, yes, and very rapidly. But when you have fiber, it makes all the difference. So there you see it again, the carbohydrates. We need to have distinguish between simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. The whole foods as grown, this is what you want, especially when they're not refined. These are the good carbs. Whole foods as grown. Yes, you can have 3-4 fruits a day, even as diabetics, especially when you eat them with a high fiber content of food. You have a banana and you have some brown rice with it. Great combination. The fiber slows down the digestion and assimilation of the sugar in the banana. On the other hand, you have complex carbohydrates. And again, complex carbohydrates can be dangerous if they're refined. If it's white flour, stay away from it. If they're not refined, whole foods as grown, you have the best of all worlds. And when that happens, you see not only that your blood sugar comes down, but also your cholesterol comes down by 20%, your triglycerides comes down, oftentimes up to 40%, your blood pressures go down. Here you see we had 210 people with high blood pressure, 210, and after 4 weeks, there were only 69 people still with high blood pressure. The last slide. Some 50 to 75% of insulin-using type 2 diabetics and 80 to 90% of those on pills could normalize their blood sugars and be off medication within weeks if they changed their diet. Our greatest challenge is to reach out to our medical colleagues and help them to understand, not to undermine with passive resistance our efforts to turning these people into healthy people. Because there's a abundance of lack of understanding among our colleagues because we don't teach nutrition in most medical schools. And so they do their very best, and besides, they're under the gun. They've got 10 minutes to see that patient. But we can help them by offering them an educational program. Thank you so much.